Today on Crazed Performance Repair, we are in a 2014 E63S Mercedes-Benz AMG. So we are worried about a transmission concern basically in this car, and we're going to go ahead and show you what the concern is first before we get into the video. So as you can see in the little clip in the corner here, there is a fluctuation on the RPMs that is happening under load, and that fluctuation is what's causing, or what the concern is basically. You can notice the vehicle is also quite noisy. That's because this thing has an exhaust. It has a couple other little add-ons to it, so it's a little bit more special than just the standard AMG. But we're going to go ahead and get started on the repair for this, and we'll show you what the solution is. As you can see, we are under the vehicle. We have some plastic to go ahead and pull down. I'm going to do that first, and then we're going to get started with pulling the valve body out. Now, there's a couple solenoids that have some screens on them that we have to double check to make sure they're not plugged up with debris. I could imagine that could definitely cause some kind of a clutch concern where it would force a slippage because it's got a little blockage, so it can't get quite enough fluid flow to the clutch pack to lock it properly, and that might be part of the issue as well. So this car is modified. It's got a little bit of a tune. It's got an exhaust. It's got a couple things going on, making approximately a little over 600 to the wheel. So it's making a decent amount of power. We just have to make sure that that torque that it makes down low actually holds when you're trying to slowly pass somebody on the highway or something, because right now it slips, as you can see in the video you're watching now. So let's go ahead and get started, get everything out. I'm going to bring you guys right back as soon as I get the oil pan off, because that's where you're going to need to see what has to happen from that point forward. Okay, so we are to the point where we have to pull this valve body off. There are bolts that hold the valve body itself, and bolts that, there's two halves to this valve body. There's parts that hold the halves together, and then there's bolts that hold the actual two halves to the main of the transmission. What we're going to do first is, of course, pull the filter out of the way. It's going to make a mess, just because that's what these transmissions do, any transmission for that matter. And we're going to go ahead and start yanking some bolts out in a time-lapse format. And I may overlay in the corner for you guys, but if I don't, just watch and we'll get this valve body off and we'll start doing the surgical things on it as well. Okay, so before you pull this thing officially down, there's a couple things you want to make sure you do. This guy here, it comes out of this. You can see I have a couple of bolts here. Those are just to keep it from dropping suddenly, but you want to make sure this guy is that direction because it'll clear this top piece. This piece is going to be rather expensive to replace if you need to. And then over here, there's a connector. You want to make sure you disconnect this guy because this is a pass-through that's going to have to slip out of there when I go to pull this down. So I'm going to go ahead now and finish pulling this down, and then we will get it on the bench and take a look at it. Okay, so in second thought, you're going to actually have to pull this parking paw mechanism down to get it to clear. There's another piece of plastic above that that is also in the way. So I'm going to try and figure out how to get that out of the way, and then I'll go ahead and finish pulling it. Alright, so here is the very interesting Benz status valve body assembly. Now, I'm not very familiar with these, I'll be honest. So, I have had one of these down once before, a different version that did not have the module integrated like this one is. Now, this is actually a control module, and then these are all the solenoids. The one I pulled apart, if I'm remembering correctly, which was a long time ago, these solenoids were in the side of the valve body instead and lined up on both sides, and then of course it's still bolted up the same way, but it was a completely different looking valve body. So what we want to look for with this valve body is to check for any debris and contaminants anywhere. I guess if you were to have a problem with these transmissions, a lot of times there'd be metal on top of the valve body, and this thing has nothing on top of it. So I'm not too concerned about this one, but what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to pull a couple solenoids out, inspect a couple of things, and just take a look at various situations. Like this is a bunch of clutch material that is on the surface of this plate. Now, I notice there's no gasket for this plate to go to the transmission, which is kind of interesting to me that they don't do that. Most transmissions will put a gasket there. They must have a high enough volume in the pump and good enough machining process that they don't feel it's necessary. So I'm going to go ahead, pull a couple things apart here, and we're going to see if we can find anything that's out of the ordinary. But before I pull it apart, of course, I'm going to go ahead and dump some of this fluid out, because there is a lot of fluid going on in here. And in order to do that, I'm just going to lay it on its side. You can see it's draining out. I'm just going to let it drain for a little while. And then I'll go grab myself a cup of coffee and come back to tear it down. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and pull these solenoids out here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and inspect each individual one. There's a screen on this end, there's a screen on this end, and I'll just wipe down the outside of them because I see that they're dirty. I mean, it's not necessary, just an overkill step. I'm going to inspect each one, make sure the contacts that are in here look good. There's a little like spring-loaded connection there. So I'm just going to check that, put it back in if it's good. And in fact, I might actually ohm these after a little bit, but the first thing I'm going to do is just look for a little debris in each individual screen. Once I do that, then yeah, I'll just go ahead and ohm them, even though they would throw a code if there was an ohm issue. I'm just going to ohm them out of my own curiosity, just to see what they are. High impedance, low impedance, etc. This one actually had a little bit of metal on the O-ring itself, but nothing big, real small stuff. Now, if you were to have a code for a solenoid on one of these, you would definitely be ohming them to check them. So I'm going to go ahead. This one does not have any codes for the solenoids themselves, so I'm just going to ohm one here, 5.5 ohms roughly. That way, in case you guys need to check yours, you'll know what they are. I'm going to check all of them just to make sure that they're all the same. That's 5.5 too. I'd imagine they're all going to be the same, but I'm going to ohm a few of them just for good measure here. Okay, most of them ohm between 5.2 and 5.5. There was the one that ohmed at 6, but for the most part, they're between 5 and 6. So I noticed one thing when I put this one back in. Right here, there's a port that literally shot fluid at me. So there, see it? Just popped some fluid out. So obviously this solenoid goes to that little port right there, which is kind of an interesting thing. But those are what are controlling your transmission, clutch packs, and all the rest. I'm going to go ahead and get this thing back together. I'm going to look at what the torque is for these bolts. My guess is that it's 89 inch-pounds, but do not quote me on that. Go ahead and check for yourself what it is. I'm going to zing it down to just contact point with this. Then I'm going to go check torque spec. And once I have torque spec, I'll actually torque it down. This is a transmission that I would not want to go without a proper torque spec on anything for, especially considering there are aluminum bolts that hold this valve body to the transmission, and they are not very tight. Those are probably less than the 89 inch-pounds that most bolts that size are, but I will find out when I look it up. Hopefully they're not a torque to yield. So torque spec on these bolts on this particular model is going to be 8 Newton meters. Make sure you check per your exact transmission model. So the 722-0.9 is what this one is. So these are going to be 8 Newton meters. The bolts that go in here appear to be 4 Newton meters plus 90 degrees, but it does not say to replace the bolts, so I imagine they're not torque to yield. They're just a different version of torquing, which is kind of odd to me. Normally when you do a degree of rotation type torque, they're torque to yield bolts, but it does not claim to be. I'm going to look further into that. Make sure you do so on yours. I'm not going to be able to answer everything for you, but that is what I found for my information available, and so that's what I'm going to go off of. And it's actually under 89 inch-pounds, which is what the domestic version of torque is. If you're from a foreign country or whatever, we go in inch-pounds when it comes to lighter torques. You guys go in Newton meters for pretty much everything. Your system is much easier, but of course I have to convert to inch-pounds for my stuff because that's the torque wrench I have. Now I'm going to go ahead and install this valve body up here without being on camera. But basically what you want to do is when you go ahead and install it, there's a couple of little things that go up into a couple of holes here. So there's a plastic deal that has to guide in there. You want to make sure you get that in there correctly, because if you screw that up, you're going to have major problems. Also, be sure that you get this pin lined up as you're putting it in there. That little plastic deal that I showed you before, be sure to get that lined up around this pin as you're going up into here. And then the connector here, the little pass-through connector, clean out this hole before you push it in there, because that hole is going to go in a lot easier if you have it clean, and you're not going to end up with the debris, obviously, in the transmission that you don't want. So I'm going to go ahead and slide this in, get it all put back together, get the filter in and all that, and we're going to move along to the torque converter removal, or wet clutch in this case. So we're going to get that removed, and in order to do that, we have to pull down the transmission. So I'm going to get started on that as soon as we get to the next clip, and I have all this assembled. Alright, I got the pan filter, all that back in. I did leave one bolt out here, and I don't have these torqued down yet. These are a torque to yield bolt. You want to reuse or use new ones for the pan here. I left those untorqued until I get this one on here and I'm finished. But this one has to be off because of the connector, that pass-through connector. There's a heat shield or protective shield for the drive shaft or something that goes and covers up where that connector connects to, so you can't get at it unless you have that piece off of there. So I'm leaving that off for now. I'm going to go ahead and get started on getting the transmission out. Now, in order to get the transmission out, I'm going to start off with this heat shield that's back here, get it down out of the way, and start working on the drive shaft. That's going to be my first line of attack. After that, I'm just going to have to wing it and see what I can come up with, but this transmission should be relatively easy to get out. It doesn't look too horribly complicated. The only thing is the two drive shafts that go one to the front diff and then one to the back diff. Other than that, it should be relatively easy at this point. Alright, we're going to go freehand camera now. So now that we're holding the camera, we're going to go ahead and show you a little bit of what to do when you're about ready to pull the trans. So I have the trans mount loose. You saw that. I got both drive shafts disconnected. That became an issue, and I should probably get into that real quick. So this car has electronically shifted in and out of gear transmission. There's a module. You can see that module right there. And that module is what's shifting the mechanical linkage inside the transmission to take it out of park, put it in reverse, neutral, drive, what have you. So that unit there is the only way you can move it into reverse, drive, neutral. I tried pulling the pan, thinking that there's a little bolt that holds the mechanism that moves, and it doesn't separate it from the shaft. The shaft must have some kind of spline or something on it that makes sure it still stays locked, and that thing just holds it tighter or something. But it looked like something that would release it, and it does not. So you can't do it that way. You actually have to plug everything back in, turn the key on without starting it, because I didn't have fluid in it. So if you have fluid in it, that's fine to start it, whatever. But if you try and shut it off, it goes right into park. So because this is a push button car, not an actual key. If you have an actual key, you're in luck. In theory, you should be able to put it in neutral, turn the key back, and it'll stay in neutral. This one does not do that. There's probably some sort of an override procedure that you can do to keep it in neutral. I just don't know what it is. I didn't sit there and stare at the owner's manual for days. Instead, what I did, since I'm disconnecting the transmission anyway, is I just went ahead and put it in neutral, then crawled underneath the vehicle, and then I took and disconnected this connector to prevent this thing from changing its position. So I just unplugged it, and then went back up into the car, turned the key off, shut the door, good to go. Then I was in neutral, and I was able to get to the drive shaft bolts for all the bolts. So the drive shaft bolts, the rear one I did while the vehicle was still in park, so that was easy. But as you can imagine, as you're trying to turn the bolts loose, the drive shaft tries to rotate. So the front drive shaft I had trouble with. I could not find a way to hold the front drive shaft other than to go through the wheels. And in order to hold the front drive shaft from the wheels, see that little extension in there? I had to throw a 3/8 extension in this side and an Allen on the other side. Of course, now I can't get the thing out. There we go. But that extension will wedge up against the brake rotor here. So you just put a little rag or something if you want to prevent damaging the paint, but most likely you're not going to have any damage. There's very little torque against it. So put something in there to prevent this thing from rotating. And then once you go to loosen that thing up, you can do a couple bolts at a time and then just use this to jam it into place. I had to do it on both driver and passenger side in order to hold it. So now we'll go ahead and get into how to hold the motor and turn the motor over, because you have to get at the bolts for the wet clutch. That's so weird to say when it looks like a torque converter. But up in the front of the vehicle, you'll have to pull the front cover. So there's the front balancer. I have a ratchet hooked up to it. This one is a 27mm socket that I'm using. It's just a short socket with a 1/2-inch ratchet. And then on the transmission side here, there's a little window in this spot. So I'm going to have to remove this bracket that I'd imagine is for a factory converter, catalytic converter. And then on the inside there are some bolts that you have to line up. Once you get those bolts, then you're able to take a Torx bit and put the Torx bit on there and obviously remove those. There is 3 pairs of 2. So there's a total of 6 bolts. Once you get the 6 bolts out, then you can start doing the bell housing bolts, and that's what we're going to go ahead and transfer over to in the little section below as I go in the corner. So let's go ahead, get those bolts out of there, and then we'll start lowering this transmission and getting it out of the car. I'm finally to the point where I'm pulling the transmission down. So I had a little bit of difficulties while doing this. Oh, there's a restrictor in here. That's interesting. I just noticed something. This is... There's a little screen in the end of here with a restrictor orifice. Not sure how well you can see that. So that's different. That's in the end of the line here. So I suppose that'd be a good thing to check and verify that that screen isn't plugged. Anyway, let's continue. So I had a lot of trouble. Now this line here I could not remove until I dropped the transmission down. This tunnel is too tight in this area. And then that line is attached up here with one of those inverted Torx. There's also, can't see it from where you're at, there's no way, but there's also one of those line holders that goes around the line with a screw in it, and it's on the side of the transmission approximately above these 2 little deals here. So be sure to pull that off too. Now the line over here, so far I have tweaked it a little bit. I really had to finagle things over on the end next to the engine oil pan. I had to disconnect a couple of fittings. And then, of course, there's a couple lines I had to really finagle and move around to get it so I can position it the best so I can pull this down. I think I'm ready to finish lowering this thing. I just have to play with this line as I lower it and slowly move it back. This rubber bushing on the drive shaft, I should have pulled that out. I'm going to finish pulling it out. I only have 1 more bolt. That'll help with getting a little more room to get this thing dropped down and lowered back. And there's 2 bolts on the top of the bell housing that are extremely difficult to get at. And as soon as the transmission is down, I'll go ahead and show you guys why they're so tough to get at and what you have to do to get at them. But there's no way I could show you with the transmission in place to show you how to get a hold of those or get them out. Now, I have this guy here kind of flopping around. I'm actually going to leave it in this down flopped position. I think it'll help me with this line so I don't get it caught. And then other than that, it's pretty much self-explanatory. I just have to lower this thing down. I have everything disconnected, I believe. I don't think anything else is attached. And I'm going to get started with dropping it down. So here we are. We have the flex plate sitting here. So the part that makes this thing such a challenge to get at is this piece right here. You can see this bracket and where it goes. So obviously it attaches on those 2 there on the outside of the bell housing from the bolts here. So you have to get these 2 bolts off first. And these guys here, you can see how this guy, when it's sitting in there, it's like right against this. This covers it up. So this part actually comes against the top of the bell housing of the transmission. And so you cannot access this bolt or this bolt over on this side. What you have to do is you have to push this up, and there's a lot of tension against here. In fact, I'm noticing now, if I were to take this O2 sensor and loosen this line up so I have a little more give, it'd probably be a lot easier for me. There we go. So what I'm going to do when I go to put this back together is I'm going to find something. Oops, and of course I fell in my bucket of fluid. So I'm going to find something that I can put here to kind of hold this thing up and out of the way until I put the transmission into place, because this thing being at an angle, I don't know how well you can see that on camera, but this guy is at an angle here. So it makes it very hard to get up here with the extension, because the extension has to go all the way to the back by the drive shaft in order to get at it. I'd use about 3 feet of extension almost. So this guy here, these 2 bolts, very, very difficult. This has to be pushed out of the way, so you have to use one hand to push it, another hand to access it, and kind of guide the socket onto the inverted Torx deal there. So a little bit awkward, but it is doable. It's very, very challenging though. I have to admit that. It took me way more than I expected it to. So now we have to put the wet clutch slash torque converter slash whatever in the world this thing actually is. It's technically a wet clutch. We have to put this guy in. This is the new replacement, or maybe a remand. Probably a new replacement, I would imagine. I don't know. But a shout out to Amola here in Minnesota for sending this, or getting my customer hooked up with this. They happen to have one on hand. He couldn't find one anywhere else, and they actually gave him one hell of a deal on this unit, better than he could get anywhere else. So shout out to Amola for hooking him up. And with that, let's go ahead and get this guy slid into place. Let's talk a little bit about splines on a torque converter, aka wet clutch, I guess, it's going to be the same concept. It's just normally it's on a torque converter for the way that these things hook up. So when putting a torque converter in, you want to be sure, or wet clutch in this case, that you fill the thing up with fluid. You don't want to run it dry when you first start it. Then after that, you got to make sure you get the splines lined up. Now in this video, I forgot to get a clip of me actually lining it up properly. I did not get the full clip. Something happened with the video. But with that, you just got to make sure that you do a proper job of getting everything lined up. There's actually a procedure for making sure you have it seated in all the way. Now, when you pull it out, you could take a measurement before you actually pull the torque converter / wet clutch, whatever you have out. You can take a measurement from the face of the bell housing to the depth of the torque converter with a straight edge. And that way you can get a baseline, assuming the torque converter has not moved when you pulled the transmission out. So as you can see, I was struggling a little bit. I got some of the bell housing bolts actually bolted into place or started into place. I started several of them, then I had to reposition the engine stand, aka transmission jack. And once I did that, then I was actually able to get the dowel pins lined up. Now I'm going to go ahead and finish tightening up the bolts just a little bit on the bottom here, just enough so that the transmission is actually against the engine, nice and seated perfectly. That way I can remove the jack and then get at the top bolts for the bell housing. Alright, I finished assembling the fine little pieces, all the little things, except for the bottom cover. So I did the heat shield and attached some of this fabric-y type bottoming material, but I haven't done any of the plastic up front here. And for obvious reasons, I still got to fill the transmission, or I still had to fill the transmission. I have filled it already. However, I have this valve closed because the fluid is overfilled in the pan, but in the pan only. So I recovered most of the fluid on this thing due to the simple fact that it was in really good shape yet. So I just put in what I had recovered, which obviously I still lost some. So I added another quart on top of that, plus the stuff that was in the wet clutch. I don't know how much that wet clutch holds. So, I poured a little bit in there when I installed the wet clutch, but it doesn't really, I don't think I poured very much. I just did enough so that it wouldn't be dry inside there. So I have a temp gauge here. However, you're supposed to use a scan tool to check it. But I'm going to use this as a rough estimate for now. Now you're supposed to get the car fired up to temperature, up to 45 degrees Celsius or 118 degrees Fahrenheit, or 113. 118, 130, I don't know, do a conversion. 45 degrees Celsius on the transmission temperature. So I'll be checking the transmission temperature periodically. But once it's at that temperature and it's just dribbling out of the fitting here, that's when I'm going to have to put the drain plug in. So I'm going to go ahead, fire it up, get that done. Once I have the thing properly filled to the proper level, then I will go ahead and put the rest of the plastic covers on. When the plastic cover's on, obviously I'll be done with the car, and I'll be able to take you guys on a test drive to show that the concern is or is not fixed. So we're going to go ahead, bring you guys back when I'm on the test drive. I'm not going to have you guys sit and watch me fill transmission or check transmission fluid. The explanation should be enough. Make sure that you check per your specific vehicle, although I'm pretty sure all Benz are the same exact way with the same exact temperature. I've done several of these, and this thing's close enough that even a few degrees is not going to make or break the vehicle or make a difference. So I usually only break out the scanner after I shut it off, and then when I fire it back up, I just see if it is close to this. If it is, then I go ahead and send it out because I know that it's close enough. I'll just zip this underneath the car and hit the button and let it do its little reading. But I will be hooking a scanner up to it for our test drive just to watch for any kind of slippage and to do a wet clutch relearn procedure, which is something that you're also going to want to have done. If you don't have access to a scan tool, the dealership does offer a relearn procedure for these wet clutches that you can get done. So you can also probably find a German enthusiast shop that would be willing to do it as well. Ma and pa shops probably won't know where to look or how to do it. They might. Some of them can be pretty good at what they're doing, and they know their things. They know how to do it, but Mercedes-Benz are pretty slim in the ma and pa style shops. So I'm gonna go ahead and get this finished up, buttoned up, and then you guys will be on a test drive with me. So I'm cruising along in the Benz here. It's a couple of months at least later from the actual repair situation. The work that I did in the video that you guys just watched was not what actually fixed the problem on this particular car. However, the wet clutch scenario does definitely apply as a potential problem for these cars, so this whole video still applies. I think it's just a situation of a very unique situation with this particular car because of the performance modifications that have been done. The tune on this car was actually the real culprit as to why the wet clutch would not hold properly. So we are actually cruising right now, and we're going to go ahead and show you how it's supposed to respond versus how it did respond. I'll do a side-by-side comparison up in the screen here. Oh, I can have a... There we go. So along with doing the tune to finally correct this thing, but beforehand he actually had taken the car to the dealer, had all the learning procedures reprogrammed, and tried to address those first, and none of that took care of the problem. It all came down to the tune when you get to the end of the storyline here. So, little lesson, I guess, learned is if performance things are done to the car, you might want to address the possible performance issues first, just in case that's the actual source of the problem. So, hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you on the next episode.
Fun time.